right, welcome back, everybody, to episode number 47 of the Rep by Rep Strength Podcast with Dr. Tim Suchomel, now at the University of Pittsburgh. So, Dr. Suchomel, thanks for taking a few minutes to sit down today.
I appreciate it. Yeah, always nice to hop on with you, catch up and everything. But yeah, in the new role, it's really exciting.
Yeah, so a little bit of a change of geography for you, right? You're out at Carroll. How long were you out there getting that lab set up and rolling?
8 years at Carroll, and then it's kind of funny because my first job was actually in Pennsylvania, straight out of my PhD. I was on the east side of Pennsylvania at East Stroudsburg. Then I came to Carroll for 8 years, and now we're back in Pennsylvania, just on the west side.
All right, so somewhere you're kind of familiar with a little bit.
Yeah, different atmosphere, totally.
A little bit bigger. So you were talking about you got some new toys to play with, some new things that I'm sure is going to drive some new research for you. So, what are some new projects you got in the works?
Absolutely. So, yeah, I'm housed in the neuromuscular research lab, and thankfully we're well funded. Dr. Brad Nindle is our director out there, and he does a really good job. We do a lot of military research, and it's housed over there. But we have a direct relationship with our master's students, working directly with the Pitt teams. So there's and all of the students do capstone projects that are related to some of the data that they're collecting with the Pitt teams. So all the data that we're collecting, it can be anything from force plate data to wearables and things like that. So GPS units but the other thing that we have out at the NMRL is a lot of unique bone analysis, as well as we have our DEXA and everything out there for body composition and things like that. So we also have an entire wet lab that we can do muscle biopsies, as well as salivary analysis and things like that. So there's a lot of unique opportunities that we have available to us. I know one project that we're going to be working on is using the iMeasureU wearable, so that we can actually track impacts, but also some load measures with our basketball teams.
Okay. All right. So you guys have a lot going on. It sounds like.
Always a lot going on.
And that seems like the GPS is becoming increasingly more research. Like it's a big area of interest for a lot of folks. So is that due to an attempt to fatigue manage at a better, higher degree? What's the area like? Why is it receiving so much attention?
Yeah, so GPS is pretty unique in the sense that obviously the athletes are wearing them throughout competitions. Our women's soccer team played yesterday, and they wear the units. Our women's volleyball team plays tonight, as well as men's soccer. So they're tracking a variety of things. So GPS obviously gives you location, but it also gives you the speed at which you are moving. So what's unique about it is that we can actually see for lack of a better term, the zones that they're in, for how long were they at X speed, how long were they walking, how long were they jogging, et cetera, et cetera. But other things that you can get from that are player load and impacts and things like that. Now, obviously, there's some math in the background that's going on with some of those measurements that I don't fully understand. So that being said, you have a variety of measurements that are available to you, but we usually limit our analysis to a handful of able to kind of see the stress that the athlete's under. So really what it does is it provides us with a measure of their external load, if you will.
Got it. So yeah, we were talking a few minutes ago about one of the cornerstones of whoever you're working with is, let's assume we have good mobility, flexibility, pain free as possible, but the first bucket to fill is strength. So why is that so important to general population versus athletes, police, fire, tactical, things like that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, strength, I feel like this sounds weird to say, but I feel like strength is almost misinterpreted sometimes. And so my definition of strength, and from my mentor and a handful of other people, has evolved over the years. But when we're younger, we're generally taught that strength is the durability, or the in terms of our field, how much weight someone can lift. And the reality is, I identify strength as an ability, but specifically an ability to produce force. So, within this realm, I'd like to say Newton was kind of the first strength coach, because understanding the forces and all of that. But at the same exact time, if we put that into context, an ability to produce force, but beyond that, in a task specific context. So, if I'm going to be sprinting, I have my body weight that I have to handle. So I have to produce force again, the ground reaction forces to resist my body weight, but also the forces that I'm putting into the ground, so that are going to propel me forward. I have braking forces, I have propulsion forces, vertical, horizontal, to all deal with all of that. But then you could switch gears completely and say, well, now I'm going to perform a 180-degree change of direction task, and it changes everything. You now have a different amount of time that you have to produce force over, but also your body position is going to be completely different. I mean, I hope you're not changing direction in the same position that you are sprinting, but if it's a shallow, you might 45 or even shallower than that, you might be able to get away with it. But if we're changing direction 180 degrees, body position is going to be completely different. So the amount of force, the time at which we have to produce force to be able to perform that successfully and efficiently is going to be very unique to that task. But again, if we move beyond that, a squat, a weightlifting movement like a hang clean or something like that, both of those may be or they are related in terms of the movement, the extension of the hip, knees, and ankles, but the time at which that they are being performed is very unique. The body position is going to be very unique. Counter movement jump is another task that's going to be specific, a squat jump, and you could list on and on and on. But the reality is, strength, in my opinion, is it's an ability to produce force within a task specific context. Why is it important? Because force makes us move. So if we talk about kind of the geriatric population, if we are going to be trying to prevent falls, for example, you watch grandma and grandpa and everyone walking around. They may be out strutting their stuff and everything, but generally speaking, they're not taking very long strides. It's very short strides together, to stay within kind of their center of mass, because if they get outside their center of mass, they're going to fall over. And I have always asked my students this question: do falls happen slowly? And generally speaking, they don't, unless you're in one of those terrible dreams that you're just falling forever and ever and ever. I don't wish that upon anybody. But because falls happen very quickly, that means in order to prevent a fall, like if we put our foot down to try to stop ourselves, we need to produce a lot of force, and we need to produce it quickly. So how that relates back to the athlete is, I would rather have an athlete that produces a lot of force over a short period of time, rather than a moderate amount of force over a longer period of time. So this comes down to the concept and physics of an impulse. So an impulse equally can be flat and long, or it can be tall and short. And both of these impulses could equal the exact same number. The exact same number produces the same outcome, but within a different time period. The faster athlete, we've always been told, wins, and that's very true when it comes to how much force we create within a shorter period of time.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That reminded me when you were talking about the foot catching the body of, a couple things there was, I remember one of my mentors was talking about sprinting is basically just catching yourself from falling over at a very high rate.
Yeah.
Um, Secondly, one of my professors at IU was Dr. Kosea, and his area of interest was in neuromuscular development. And he talked about power, and we're essentially trying to change the shape of the curve from a U
Hmm.
to a V, more or less, and talked about, he worked with a lot of geriatric populations to do strength training so that if they do, you know, to prevent falls from happening in the first place. If we're strong, the likelihood of a fall is going to decrease dramatically. Uh, but yeah, anyway, just that as you were talking about that, I was like, oh yeah, I remember Dr. Kosea going into that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, reality is, we were talking earlier about kind of the different phases of a vertical jump or a counter movement jump. You can generally tell based on the shape of the curve which athlete is going and the timing of that curve, which athlete is going to be more efficient in their ability. So you can look at obviously you can get a lot from a force time curve, but the phase analysis and the shape of the actual curve can tell you a lot about how an athlete produces, handles, whatever words you want to use, the amount of force within that specific movement. Um, Sprinters and basketball players, generally speaking, are going to have very short counter movements, and the reason why is because they have to get off the ground really fast. But within that time period, because they shorten their downward movement, they have to be able to handle those eccentric forces or braking forces within that short period of time. So, an emphasis being placed on those certain phases for those athletes is incredibly important.
mhm. Now, I have a question that I'm hoping you can answer here for that I run into almost daily. So I work on a base with a lot of military folks, and there's tons of PCSs and rotations happening, and I'll run into people. I'll introduce myself and say, let me know if I can help you with anything. And anyway, surprisingly high amount of folks have been beat up, and you know they're sore. Their bodies just don't move well, and I don't know if they were ever taught how to properly lift or train in the first place. So I'll hear this phrase a lot, and they'll say this: well, I used to lift heavy, and now I just do lightweight for high reps, and I don't need to lift heavy anymore. So can you give us a bit of a compelling argument as to why it's important to still train heavy in some capacity?
Sure. I mean, the reality is, heavy is relative, right?
Right.
But at the same exact time, one, I would caution anyone to continually do the same thing over and over and over again. That I think that's leading into the definition of insanity, right? I'm continually sore. Well, the reality is, if you're doing a ton of reps and you're doing them, essentially to failure all the time, you're probably going to be sore. There's a lot of muscle damage that's going on there, but at the same exact time, varying the stimulus is going to be really important. So, why is it important to go heavy occasionally? Well, heavier loads in general are going to provide a more unique stimulus to the neuromuscular system as well as the skeletal system. So, heavier loads will allow us to stimulate more bone growth, but also maintain, obviously, our bone density. So, if you go look at some of the elite power lifters over the years, there's been a couple studies that have looked at things like bone density and in weightlifters and power lifters, and there's a reason why their bone density is so high. It's because their skeletal system had to tolerate those loads, those forces put on their body for long periods of time. Now, I would caution anyone to go from doing nothing to lifting something incredibly heavy, right off the bat, because it's all about progression, overload, and individualization at that point. But at the same time, being able to expose your body to heavier loads periodically is going to also stimulate the strengthening of different tissues, including bone, including tendons, including ligaments, the muscles, obviously. But that in itself also allows us to not only produce more force, which again would benefit our movement, um, but it also starts to allow us to produce force more quickly and kind of turn on and turn off our the motor units within the task as necessary. So the reality is stronger individuals may be more efficient in their movements because they don't have to use all of their motor units all the time. If we took the person who's sitting on their couch doing nothing, and then they tried to perform certain tasks and even activities of daily living, they can be very difficult. But if you add the additional overload of something that's going to be something that's a little heavier than what they're used to, then those types of tasks may become easier and easier. You hear from kind of the general population, what's your goal for training? They said, oh, well, I want to be able to play with my kids. I want to be able to lift them up and things like that. There's a really good commercial. It was an older, and I think it was an older man that kept going into his garage and was lifting up paint buckets or something like that,
I remember
and
that.
continually, lifted things up and put them on the shelf. But the idea is that he's adding an additional overload to what he has had previously, and as a result of that, he's getting himself stronger within that specific task, which allows him then to lift up that kid. So again, we train movements in the weight room. We're not training specific tasks. So if we squat, for example, we're strengthening, the hips, the knees, the ankles, the core. But at the same exact time, any movement that will then have extension or flexion of those movements will become stronger. And then, of course, by adding an additional overload, the classic example is in order to get strong, you have to lift heavy eventually. So, um, you know, strong is relative to the individual, but so is the ability to, classify what is heavy and what isn't.
So that's an excellent segue because my next question here is, you know, I see people who mistakenly will just see an advanced, they'll not realize that it's an advanced program. Number one, they don't take into account the biological age, the training age, all of those factors, and they just copy and paste. And then, sure enough, disaster happens later. So I think if people were educated on how to properly qualify themselves to figure out like what's an appropriate place to start versus advanced techniques, can you kind of give us some distinction here of what qualifies someone as a beginner versus an advanced or an intermediate or an
Sure.
elite?
Yeah, I mean, again, the training age for individuals is very unique because it comes down to the experience that they've had with the movements and the quality of that experience, but also the coaching that they've had or lack of coaching. All of us probably remember the very first time that we did a Romanian deadlift or a stiff leg deadlift, because the next couple days you look at that set of stairs and you're thinking, no way can I get down those things, right? But looking at a program, generally speaking, what I've found over the years is that um, individuals who either have a limited experience in terms of programming and or maybe program usually see really high repetitions. The classic example, and it's been around since probably the 40s, is 3 sets of 10. So you'll get individuals that'll say, "Yeah, I'm doing 3 sets of 10 so I can get stronger." That's a conversation for another day, but the reality is, can you get stronger lifting that? Yes, for a while, but eventually you're going to have to decrease the reps if you actually want to get really strong. So With that being said, beginner programs, you see higher repetitions, but you'll also see a lot of exercises.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just see, you see single joint, a lot of single joint movements versus multi joint movements in beginner programs, because it comes back to kind of the bodybuilding mentality rather than I don't even know what to call it, but the core development mentality. Now, just to clarify, core movement, I'm referring to multi-joint big muscle movements that also incorporate the smaller movements, or the smaller muscles rather. Versus more of an advanced type program, I would say that you see fewer exercises, but they're bigger muscle movements, and they also may have some more ballistic intent to them as well. So this is where, I'll call it more of a not beginner or advanced, more that intermediate. You start to see fewer exercises, but this becomes a focus of that squat, press, and pull.
Yep.
So your hinge type movements, single limb exercises versus bilateral movements all the time. But as you become more and more advanced, what we've found within the literature and what has been suggested is that there starts to become a shift of an emphasis where it's less about developing, absolute strength, how much weight you can lift. It becomes more ballistic in nature and faster. So more focus on that power development and rate of force development with the exercises, while maintaining your strength. So you start to see a lot of the Olympic variations or weightlifting movements. You start to see, your jump squats, plyometrics. You also see some variations in terms of the squatting and bench pressing type movements, in terms of if people are using chains and bands, or if they're using weight releasers with accentuated eccentric loading. So you can gradually see that there's not going to be as much shiny, sexy
Mm-hmm.
stuff with the beginner programs. But if I would again caution people that that's where you should start. Develop those foundational movements before you start to add in the shiny stuff. Because the other caveat to all of this is that if you start with all the shiny, fancy stuff, you
Mm-hmm.
can't use it as a novel training stimulus later.
Yep.
So starting with the basics, progressing from your bilateral movements, getting to the combination of bilateral, unilateral, start to add in big multi-joint movements, getting to adding some speed to it, some of the basic weightlifting variations, like your pulling derivatives, but then obviously graduating to things that you can modify the stimulus with a little bit, chains, bands, weight releasers, somewhere along the spectrum, you have the flywheel devices, tempo training. So there's a variety of different things along that training spectrum. But yeah, basics. We've always say do the basics savagely well before you can do any before you start to add in the toys.
Yeah, that's a great explanation, because the that reminds me of when I was talking with Dr. Tabor, and he was talking about thinking of, imagine you've got a wall where you've got some levers, and once you pull the lever, you can't you can't unpull that lever. So
Exactly.
you need to be strategic in how you arrange the levers that you're pulling. Um, but this also reminds me of a guy at work the other day who was deadlifting, and he's a very experienced power lifter, and he did was it 605 for, I think it was 4 or 5 sets of three, and then he was done for the day. And
Oh yeah.
my favorite thing was that there's some other guys that were like, "Hey, well, what's he gonna do for this muscle, this muscle, this muscle?" I'm like, "He already did it, man. Like, there's nothing
Yeah.
else."
What's really interesting to me is similar to that is I guess the other aspect of more of an advanced program is you start to see what we call split routines. where you're going to have focus on specific body parts. Again, that's the building mentality. You're going to have more training sessions, but you're also going to have split body parts at certain times. Now, I would say that from a hypertrophy standpoint, muscle growth, that's certainly beneficial. But from your team sport athletes or your athletes in general, we don't isolate movements in sport. So I advocate for full body lifts, and every time we lift, and kind of emphasizing more of a push pull mix emphasis over the course of the week, where you're adding in upper body and lower body movements, and then obviously depending on the phase, ballistic variations depending on what we're using. But yeah, it's interesting that you can come in, you do a single exercise for X number of sets, and that probably took 2 hours.
Yeah, he was. It was funny because when I talked to him about, and we talk training all the time, and his his dad had taught him quite a bit about lifting, and then he's done some digging himself. But anyway, we were talking about frequency, referring back to the fit principle. What's
Hmm.
the frequency by which you do something so fatiguing? And
Hmm.
he's like, "Oh, I might deadlift maybe once." And like, and he's not counting his light deadlift sessions, which are just practicing the movement.
Hmm.
But anyway, the what I tell people who are new, that have a younger training age, is your frequency needs to be much higher in general, and the intensity is going to need to be much lower because you need to practice the movements so you can get good at the movements over time, and then gradually flip that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the reality is when it comes to the movements that we're incorporating, I would say, a bread and butter exercise of mine is going to be a back squat.
Hmm.
But you can incorporate that in really any phase of training.
Right.
But it also has different goals because it's large muscle groups, your glutes, your hamstrings, your quads, and obviously other aspects of your calves and things like that. um, I can develop hypertrophy within that. I can develop strength within that. I'm not necessarily, and this may, not agree with some people's training principles, but um, a squat exercise is not a power exercise,
Hmm.
in my opinion. You can do what you call speed squats and move squats faster, but the reality is other exercises move faster and you can generate more power during those exercises. So if you're trying to develop power with a squat, focus on the force side of things, that force and velocity relationship. But yeah, I digress.
No, no, I think where I've heard folks say that strength is measured in velocities, and then we're going to kind of pick exercises from there. Um, but I think a lot of people get married to certain exercises, and they get caught up in like, this is the only exercise that I can do.
Mm,
Like I'll like, just to dive into one, because I'm interested to hear your thought on people getting into the whole debate of, well, should we Olympic lift, or should we jump, or should we do trap bar jump shrugs? What should we do here? And which one's best for developing power? It's all, you can do all of it, but what's appropriate within your equipment that you have available, your time, all that other stuff. But yeah, just so I can get your view on when people argue about Olympic lift derivatives or the full Olympic lifts versus like a trap bar jump shrug. Is one
well,
better or worse?
I mean, we could. This is an entire podcast in itself because this is the age-old debate. Just recently, it came up on X again. Um, so just to preface all of this, I am an advocate for both exercises.
Mhm.
Um, I believe that the hex bar jump has its place. I believe all of the weightlifting derivatives have their place. So, but context is king with everything that we
Mm,
do. But what I would say is that first and foremost, if the individual does not have the skill to perform weightlifting movements in general, I think the hex bar jump is a great alternative compared to using those exercises. That being said, there are a lot of weightlifting derivatives, pulling variations in particular, that are very easy to learn.
mhm,
So things like a jump shrug, a mid thigh pull, a counter movement shrug. I could go on and on about a variety of different exercises, but there are a lot of those variations that are very easy to learn. So but they also have a specific purpose. So if I'm performing a mid thigh pull, for example, it is simply I'm going to be in the mid thigh power position of a weightlifting movement, the start of the second pull, and I'm going to rapidly extend my hip, knees, and ankles, and I'm going to shrug at the top. Because the barbell has such a very small displacement, I can use a ton of weight. I
mhm.
mean, we've investigated all the way up to 140%, but I promise you there are individual and 140% of like a power clean or hang clean 1RM, but I promise you that you can use more weight than that. Especially if you don't have to hold on to it prior to, where you're just doing it off the pins. Um, but a counter movement shrug, even, we have used 140% in our research. A hang clean pull that actually has a hip hinge, we've used 140%. So, that being said, you can use a hex bar jump to a certain point, but jump exercises are meant to be loaded with lighter loads, and the reason why is the velocity is the big driver of power output with ballistic exercises. So if you put these on a spectrum, we've done a research project that's compared the jump shrug and the hex bar jump. What ends up happening is the power output between them is comparable. They're not really all that different. But what ends up happening at really light loads, a jump shrug may produce slightly more power output compared to a hex bar jump. But as the load starts to increase a little bit, then the hex bar jump shifts and is now producing a higher power output. Um, and the reason why is the movement pattern between the two is very different. You have a jump shrug that has a hip hinge movement versus a hex bar jump does not. You're dropping pretty much straight down and straight up. The load is distributed around you. So but what we've also found within that is they have unique force velocity characteristics. A jump shrug is a more force dominant exercise, i.e., it produces more force at peak power compared to a hex bar jump. A hex bar jump is more velocity dominant compared to a jump shrug. So that being said, if we put all these exercises on a spectrum, you have your mid thigh pull counter movement shrug on one side that produce a ton of force because we can use a lot of weight within that movement. Shift all the way down to the end of the spectrum of weightlifting derivatives. You have your jump shrug, which is your most ballistic movement, your fastest movement out of all of those. But then they have their own spectrum with weightlifting movements, and you can do a lot with it. Our research, Paul Comfort's research, Christoph Kipp's research, we've shown that you can do a lot with those. But if you take a step outside of that and add in the hex bar jump, the hex bar jump adds a velocity, an additional velocity component of it. But to take this even a step farther, we're talking about weightlifting movements and hex bar jump. Well, guess what's faster than a loaded jump? An unloaded jump. What's faster than an unloaded jump? A loaded sprint. What's faster than a loaded sprint? An unloaded sprint. So you kind of get this idea of that if I'm going to train triple extension hip, knees, and ankles, I can do that with all of these different types of movements, but it doesn't have to be one or the other. There is no, single exercise that's going to accomplish all of that. You're going to get the individuals that advocate for, well, if you catch the bar in a clean, it's going to, football. I'm going to tell you, one thing gets simulating hitting football, and that's getting hit in football. we're not running at people in the weight room with a barbell and throwing it at them to try to simulate getting hit in football. So my point being with this is you have a landing component to a hex bar jump. You have a landing component to a jump shrug, but you also have a deceleration load acceptance phase to a clean, to a snatch, to a pulling variation if you don't drop the bar. So again, that comes back to the braking component, the eccentric component, where that all exists on a spectrum as well. So the answer to your question is not one or the other. It is what do you need and when.
Hmm.
And the reality is all of these are tools within the coaching toolbox that we should all be using for our athletes within the context of what they're actually capable of and the phase that they are training within.
Hmm. That's very well said. Um, yeah, and how much do you notice? Like let's say we've got some people who are fairly well advanced. They've used most of their tools. How important, if at all, is novelty to stimulate just interest in returning to the weight room so that they can have the outputs that we want them to have?
No, I mean, the funny thing was when you mentioned novelty, I was like, I hope this is where we go with this conversation. No, in reality, being able to introduce a novel training stimulus to somebody is an invaluable tool, because as we learn within an individual task itself, so we may get really good at squatting, for example. Movement patterns good, we're able to move a lot of weight, but if you add in a task constraint of something like bands or chains or weight releasers, you got to figure it out. Like it's a brand new task. We've had really good squatters like try to or rather get familiarized with weight releasers, and they're almost like diving into the rack, and it's not even heavy weight, and that's what's crazy about it. So it shifts the demands of your motor system, and you really have to learn how to generate a new, for lack of a better term, motor program within the task, because it's a unique training stimulus. So individuals who have previous experience in the weight room and then they stop lifting or whatever for a while before they come back to it, they still have that motor program to a point, but at the same time, they may have to relearn and become efficient within the movement as well, because joints may have stiffened up, or a decreased range of motion, that type of thing. Anthropometrically, did they grow? All these different things. So if you took a youth athlete who did a lot of body weight exercises, this happens all the time. If you ask a toddler to do a full squat, it's like what we would consider kind of that perfect squat, full depth, no considerations to it. But then we start sitting in a computer chair for a long period of time. We sit in a desk, we stop moving and performing that movement all the time. And then they come back and they're like, well, why can't I do this? you know growth of joints and muscle and things like that, variety of different characteristics. But the novelty of reintroducing or introducing something new to somebody, that they haven't experienced before, is invaluable, especially from an athletic standpoint, for that athlete that wants to get to that next level.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not someone I would consider an advanced athlete at all. I'm just a guy who tries really hard when I go into the weight room. But yeah, we got some AEL hooks, some weight releasers, and I think I sent you a text message or email about what are some rough guidelines I could use here, and I didn't go very heavy on those, and I was very surprised how long I was sore, uh, just from a new stimuli that I hadn't experienced. And then,
It's very unique, and I will say that weight releasers, you know, we have a number of projects in the works. Myself, Dr. Tabor, I know Justin Merrigan's done some good work. John Waggle has done some really good work. Jamie Douglas, Melissa Harden, just to throw out some other names that have done some really good AEL work. What we're finding with this is that with men and women, um, the difference between, or at least with our research, performing traditional squats versus AEL squats, um, you won't always get, again, we're doing follow-up analyses, but you won't always get a massive difference in the propulsion phase of the actual movement or the concentric phase of the movement. What you do end up getting is a difference in the braking stimulus, obviously. More load, you have to modify how you're producing force against it. But in our follow-up analysis, what we end up finding is there's no difference between stronger and weaker people with traditional squats from both a braking standpoint and mostly from a propulsion standpoint, relatively speaking. But that being said, add in weight releasers, and what you find is that stronger individuals produce more force during the braking phase. They produce more force faster in the braking phase, and they also produce more force faster in the propulsion phase. So you almost have that carryover and that potentiation effect within the actual set. But again, with all that's stronger versus weaker, double body weight versus not double body weight. Working on that paper right now. But the other thing that we see is that loads don't eccentrically don't always have to be super maximal. So I see some of these protocols, and I'm like, I would never want to do that study. Yeah, I like there's some protocols out there that you're doing 120, 125% 1RM eccentrically and like 90% concentrically. I'm like, nah, I'm good. I don't have to do that. But the heaviest loads that we've used concentrically within our research has been 80%, which you would still consider a pretty heavy load.
Yeah.
Especially when you're performing it for multiple repetitions within the actual set.
Yeah, I think some metrics that Dr. Tabor gave me was talking about maybe 3 sets of up to, and this is if you're feeling very fresh, would be up to 120%, but on the concentric would be within 70 up to 80% range.
Yeah, I mean, what we have found also with the loading research that we've done with Dr. Tabor as well, that we looked at loads concentrically that were 50, 60, 70, and 80%. We also and eccentrically looked at 100%, but also looked at 110%. So as you can imagine, when you go down and 60% falls off, it's pretty unique. But yeah, what we ended up finding between that is, as you can imagine, greater braking forces are going to be produced by heavier loads. That shouldn't be overly surprising to people. But it doesn't necessarily carry over unless you're strong to the concentric side of things. So, but again, we haven't gone over 110% in our lab. But I would also question, do you have to, with certain things? Because now, granted, some of these individuals that participated in this study didn't just squat double body weight. They did like 2.4, 2.5 times their body weight. So that being said, there is research out there to suggest that from a relative standpoint, stronger individuals are actually going to tolerate a lower percentage from super maximal loads compared to weaker individuals. And part of that has to do with the fact that weaker individuals, their 1RM is fluctuating a lot more than stronger individuals. But also they're still figuring out their movement patterns. So within the research, I think we can certainly advocate for the fact that AEL is a advanced training method
Mhm,
that should be used by stronger individuals who are competent within the movement.
mhm. Yeah, and I would be interested. I'm sure you're already digging into this of like why exactly are they what are the very specific reasons why the stronger individuals are going through these different phases at a faster rate? I mean, is it myelination? Is it, whatever's going on? Um, I I would love to hear more as you dig into this, but I do have another meeting right after this. But this has been this has been very good. This is I'm going to send this to all of my tactical folks and all of my fire individuals just so they can know that it's not just me regurgitating stuff. This is coming from people who are, more well versed in these areas than I am. So,
Oh, I appreciate it. Don't sell yourself short. You're doing quite a bit.
but yeah, thank you very much. Where can everybody find out more about what you've got going on, social media handles, all that stuff? Because I think you put out a ton of great content, speaking engagements that people can look into and all that. So I'd love to if you could share that information, please.
Sure. Yeah. Both on X and Instagram, my handle is Dr. T Suchomel. Try to put as much stuff out on there as possible, but at the same time, I'm not a social media guru. So, um, but yeah, all of our stuff on I think on X, are a link to my research gate is there. So all the research that we've done, people should be able to get access to a certain point. But yeah, then obviously you could be able to search my email at University of Pittsburgh now. So, but yeah, lots of good things going on here, and I welcome the questions and the conversation. But and again, Travis, I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thank you again, and I encourage everyone to reach out because and Dr. Tuknell is very responsive uh, on social media to comments, questions, discussions, things like that. So he's one that will actually engage and help out as much as he can. So thank you again. I really appreciate your time.
For having me.
All right, cool. Thank you very much.